What's up? I'm Dr. CBS here with Jared Ball, and you are tuned into episode 2 of The Last Dope Intellectual. In today's segment of Shoot the Shit, Jared and I are going to speak about scholar activism, or the relationship between scholarship and activism, and why it is that I personally make a distinction between the two. So let me just start by saying, often, if you've ever heard me on a podcast or speaking elsewhere, I'll often say that I don't have an activist or organizing background. And I make that distinction not because I think that academia or, scholarship is above in any way organizing or activism, but because I feel like there's a way in which sometimes academics can crowd into that space and not really be doing shit for real, but then they take on that title or they situate themselves in that way, which can really sort of erase or take up space that I think really organizers and activists should be occupying. And that space also includes resources. And so I'm just very clear that I am, I'm an academic, and that's sort of what my main contribution is. And so that's one of the reasons why I personally make the distinction. And of course, when I think about real scholar activists, I think about somebody like Joanna Fernandez. I think about even you, Jared. So which is, distinct that, I'm an ideas man, as I like to say. So that's where I'm on, what I'm on in that regard. What do you think, Jared?
No, I think that's a good point. I definitely wanted you to expand on that a little bit, because I know you mentioned it in episode 1, and I've heard it come up in other spaces, and I think it's an important distinction to make. And then even I've increasingly, if I see it on a fader, I've increasingly seen myself fading more towards the academic journalism media thing more than the activism thing, more as a true honorific of sorts to what activism means to me, and having done what I think it really means, the heavy in the streets, community organizing, offline, unpopular, cold, in the rain, all that kind of stuff. Like that to me is, the all those hard struggles with 10 people in a room that nobody ever sees, and then to your point, when sometimes, certain popular academics or even journalists come in, and certainly the nonprofit structure comes in, it just becomes something entirely different. So out of respect to what I've always understood, real activism organizing mean, I appreciated that distinction you drew, and I've always wanted to draw it myself. So definitely thanks for that one to clear that up a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And, now that I am, I have finally joined an organization, Black Alliance for Peace. Check out blackallianceforpeace.org. I do feel like I'm getting more of, obviously most of it is online at this point because of the pandemic, et cetera. But I do feel like I'm getting more of a sort of an experience with applying my politics, right? Putting some of my theories and ideas into action. And so that's been really great and really rewarding. But, that's sort of why I offer that disclaimer in terms of being an academic. I just want to, stay in my lane and also just, state how I'm positioned from the outset. And hopefully as time goes on, I will get more, experience on the ground, so they say, and just, have a holistic approach to this question of like, how do we get free and, what is to be done? So
organizing is essential, and it even as an experience, it's essential. So I definitely encourage others to join you in that effort. I need to step up in that and increase my re-engagement with BAP and many other organizations. So yeah, I mean, that's even why I like to do collective work academically and in terms of media work. I mean, we need to be working in collectives as much as possible to enhance and the impact and strengthen ourselves. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I try to imbue that ethic, that collective or cooperative, community-oriented ethic in the types of work that I do. And, so I've co-authored a lot of things. For example, I form these groups, whether it be writing groups, whether it's my junior scholar mastermind group, to bring people together to challenge this competitive individualism and this idea that, I did it all by myself, no help, whatever, the whole Kevin Hart thing. It's like, that's never how progress is made, number one. And, we are still very much invested in this sort of great man or great woman approach to history. But it's like, it's collective. It is like grinding together. It is having what I call mutual comradeship that really moves the needle forward. And so So yeah, that's,
And that's also why that work you're talking about is also why future episodes of LDI will be taped on the road.
Yeah. Right. So
on location.
Yeah. So more about that to come. But yeah, so we out here and just where everybody has their own contributions to make, I think. And for the academics and other folks, like, if you're not, stop clout chasing. Like, if that's not your bag, if you're not really immersed in these communities and doing that work, stop claiming that shit. That's not cool. Like, I don't really understand that. And it's actually detrimental. So you can just, serve the people in your own way. My sweater says serve the people. And that's cool, do it through your ideas, do it through the way you treat your students, the way you treat your colleagues, by writing for contingent faculty. There's many, many ways you can have a particular ethic without, colonizing the space of activism and organizing. So
right
there
on.
you have it. Okay, and on today's episode, we have a very special guest, Dr. Gerald Horne, who holds the Morris Professorship in History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and is also the co-author with yours truly of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and has over 40 books, some of which we will be talking about today. So thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, this is my show, The Last Dope Intellectual. It's about me. So, of course, I want the first question to be about yours truly. So we've worked on several projects together at this point, including our book, W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and also like the recently released in the Handbook of Pan-Africanism. We have a chapter together on Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism. So first, what was it like working with me? What is it like working with, me as a junior scholar who uses a lot of profanity? I like to think I'm a little bit smart. And then more broadly, why do you think it's important for senior scholars to collaborate with junior scholars?
Well, I think it's important because a person like myself has seen more yesterdays than I'll see tomorrows. And it's very important for people like myself to begin the process of passing the torch. And I also think that one brings different generational perspectives. That is to say, I grew up at a time when it was problematic and troublesome to say anything negative about Israel and good about socialism. And I don't think that is as prevalent today. At least I would like to think so. And it also governs one's expectations. What I mean is that I oftentimes say that every day that I wake up and I'm not indicted is a good day. and that's because, of course, I grew up during the Red Scare and the Cold War, and when it could be pulverizing to hold views that were perceived to be too far to the left. And so I think it's important to combine perspectives of individuals who don't necessarily share the same generational perspectives. And then I would like to think as well that the kinds of perspectives that I have been able to express in books are perspectives that should be more widely disseminated, and hopefully having a scholar of your caliber and stature will help to facilitate that, and particularly help to facilitate disseminating those ideas to people of your generation.
Sure. Yeah. And as everybody knows, first of all, my Twitter is what we call a Gerald Horne Stan account. So, all I do is, I tweet more than just about you, but I would say probably 30% of the content is something that you've said or something that you've written. So your knowledge is being disseminated in that way. And also, I owe so much of my framework, especially about the conjuncture of anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism, to your work. So I'm grateful, continue to be grateful, and hope that we can continue to collaborate in various ways, because that has been important to my own intellectual development. So shifting gears a little bit, when we were talking a while back, you had this very hilarious, you said it more hilariously than I'm going to say it now, but you have this very prescient point that, if scholars don't understand history and if they don't understand the international situation, they should be quiet. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Well, what I was referring to is what I consider to be a massive, profound intellectual failure by U.S. scholars on the left historically, and I'm afraid to say Black scholars as well. I mean, how is it, for example, that a simple term like settler colonialism, which is a descriptor for this project in the country now known as the United States of America, is not widely used even by scholars who consider themselves to be radical? How is it that you don't have a complete and full understanding of the founding of this country as an anti-abolitionist project, which helps to shed light on why Black people have been treated so atrociously and horribly since the founding of this so-called republic, not to mention a project based upon indigenous dispossession, because 1776 was a direct repudiation of the Royal Proclamation of 1762, wherein London was seeking to restrain the settlers led by land speculators like George Washington from continuing to move west, dispossessing the indigenous and then gobbling up the land. In fact, you can see this whole U.S. project as one big exercise in land speculation, which is helps to explain and helps to shed light on why the 45th U.S. president was precisely a land speculator, a real estate speculator, a real estate tycoon, so-called. And so I think that the aphorism that you just cited is no better illustrated than with regard to January 6, 2021, where you have many in the mainstream who are shocked that such an event could take place in this alleged paragon of democracy, which has this supposedly sturdy and vaunted constitution. How could this happen? Whereas you have folks on the left who routinely tend to rationalize, if not justify, the backwardness of the descendants of the settlers, tend to dismiss the profundity of January 6th because it doesn't fit into their theory of the case. It reminds me of another aphorism, oftentimes ascribed to a fictional French intellectual who says, "I know what you're saying is true in practice. The question is it true in theory?" In other words, they're elevating their theory of the case above the concreteness of reality on the ground. And so certainly, if you don't understand history, it becomes very difficult to understand such hinge moments as January 6, 2021. Likewise, if you don't understand the international situation, how can you understand the United States of America? It's not a thing in itself. It was brought into being as a result of not only conflict with London, but assistance from London's eternal enemy across the channel. Speaking of France, the pivotal Battle of Yorktown, which vouchsafed the settlers' victory against London, was basically assisted from beginning to end by France. And you could say the same to a certain degree with regard to Spain as well. And likewise, even mainstream historians acknowledge that when you try to understand the retreat of Jim Crow in the 1950s, you have to understand the international situation, the pressure on the United States to get its act together because of the contestation with the then Socialist Camp for Hearts and Minds in Africa, emerging Caribbean and other anti-colonial areas, but had difficulty doing so as long as people of color in this country were treated so horribly and atrociously. And so this creates a dynamic that leads to Brown versus Board of Education. So likewise, today, I don't think you can begin to understand what's happening in the United States unless you understand the contestation with China, for example, unless you begin to understand the contestation with the European Union. So people who treat the United States as a thing in itself are destined and bound either to be disappointed or be pessimistic.
That was a shot. I'm gonna leave it there, but that was a shot. I liked it. So two things I was thinking about as you were talking is one, in terms of your point about settler colonialism, interestingly, the ICC is planning to launch an investigation into Israel. Mm-hmm. And the three countries that have protested this, Australia, the United States, and Canada, that have what in common? Settler colonialism. So to your point, I think that it's important to understand, for sure, it's important to understand the dynamic of settler colonialism in an international way. And the other thing too, you talked about, speculation of land as the foundation of this country. One might argue also, speculation in Blackness, right? Black people, with the, the young folks call Black bodies. I wish they would stop saying that shit, but yes. So, anyway, those are just two things I was thinking about. So kind of related to this point is, your work strikes an amazing balance between examining the conditions of Black Americans and then the conditions of the situation of African people throughout the diaspora over time. And then we were having another conversation about how some scholars make it seem as if you focus on U.S. Blacks or Negroes in the U.S., as you call them sometimes, that this is somehow problematic or incomplete. What do you think is the basis of this assumption, and what are some of the effects of that type of assumption? And then what are your thoughts in general on the position of scholars, or the scholars who take this position?
Well, first of all, to your prior preceding point, speculation in, quote, Black bodies, unquote, part of the wealth that's generated in the United States of America is not only generated by dint of the exploitation of Africans on the North American mainland, but the United States quickly and rapidly becomes the main purveyor of enslaved Africans to Cuba and Brazil, ousting Britain from the leadership of the African slave trade early on, which is a curious position to be in, shall we say, for a so-called revolutionary republic, speaking of the alleged United States of America. With regard to your second point, I find that very troublesome and problematic. I mean, as a person who has written about every realm of the Black experience, be it on the African continent, be it in the Caribbean, be it in North America, be it in the South Seas, for example. So I'm obviously willing to veer beyond the confines of North America. But having said that, I find it absurd to suggest that you cannot simply focus on the confines of North America. I find that ridiculous. I find that absurd. I find it also almost chauvinistic and dismissive of whatever peculiarities that are embedded in the Black American, speaking of U.S. experience. And I think it also, it fuels movements like ADOS, the American Descendants of Slaves, which of course takes the position that I think they go too far in the other direction in terms of really stressing and emphasizing what they consider to be the uniqueness and peculiarities of the Black American, meaning U.S. experience, which oftentimes can be easily interpreted as bleeding into a kind of anti-immigrant bashing. And actually, you see this conflict on both sides. For example, David Oyelowo, the Black British or West African, Nigerian man who played Martin Luther King in Selma, he was once quoted, I'm sure he would like to take this quote back, that one of the reasons he's done so well in Hollywood is because he doesn't get involved in all of these Negro conflicts in the United States of America. Now, what that reminded me of is that when I lived in Zimbabwe in the 1990s, the Rhodesians would oftentimes turn to me and try to juxtapose me to the Africans, saying, well, why can't the Africans be like you? For example.
Oh, wow.
And, you're a hard worker. Or I realized that I'm going to be treated differently in Paris than someone who is Senegalese or Algerian. Or likewise, given the accent discrimination in London, I'll be treated differently than a Jamaican or a Nigerian. And so there is there is something to what Adolf is suggesting, but I think that for whatever reason, I think they've taken it a bit too far. And certainly they have not been helped by these alleged cosmopolitan scholars who really should know better, who in some of the worst examples have cast aspersions upon the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., because it focuses on the U.S. experience. Now, it was hard enough to get Congress to accede to a museum that focuses on the U.S. experience. Now, they say that the museum is somehow invalid because it doesn't deal in the diasporic context. Okay, fair enough. So if you have roots in the UK, for example, and you're Black, did you lobby the Labour Party in the UK to put pressure on Congress? I doubt it. And so you're just basically taking pot shots at Black Americans, which of course is a favorite sport, I'm afraid to say, in the North Atlantic community.
So what I take from many of your very sort of amazing comments is like there is a position between, you know, African Americans are everything in the center of, you know, all analysis, and fuck African Americans. And that seems to be like the two poles, like the ADOS pole on the one hand and then the cosmopolitan pole on the other. So this is why we need your work, and this is why we need your perspective. Anyway, So one of our favorite scholars I think we have in common is Jemima Pierre. You know, the amazing anthropologist. She's at UCLA. She's one of the co-editors with myself and Peter Hudson of the newly launched Black Agenda Review. Anyway, we love her. But anyway, Jemima Pierre pointed out to me that the counter-revolution of 1776, apocalypse of settler colonialism, and dawning of the apocalypse are basically a trilogy, right? That it's not just those two books, that it's those three that should be read together. However, you noted that there's actually perhaps 8 or 9 books in this ongoing series. And so what are some of the other books that you've written that belong to the analytical arc that you offer in those 3 texts? And what are you trying to argue? What is the argument that you're making?
Well, you're both right. I mean, both schools are right. I mean, certainly the dawning of the apocalypse, 16th century, the apocalypse of settler colonialism, 17th century, and the counter-revolution of 1776, which fundamentally, although not exclusively, deals with the 18th century, are part of a trilogy. And they're all part of a pre-1776 history of North America, because part of the problem with these U.S. historians is that they oftentimes siloed. If you look at the historians who critiqued the New York Times 1619 project, and since I assume you have a literate audience, I won't explain what that was about, but they were siloed historians. I mean, some of them focus on 1750 to 1800. Some of them focus on 1850 to 1875. So many of them really don't look at the broad expanse of North America, not to mention the broad expanse of pre-US history, not to mention the broad expanse of US history. And so they're ill-positioned to comment on that, not least because oftentimes you'll find these historians, and outsiders might find this hard to believe, they're proudly ignorant of being oblivious to what's going on today, which obviously does not serve them well when they begin to look at history, because history in many ways, that's the roots of what's going on today. Just like you can understand the roots by looking at what emerges from the roots, which is what goes on today. And so what I'm trying to do, obviously, is puncture the creation myth of the founding of the United States of America, this idea that these so-called founding fathers, the likes of which we have not seen before or since, they walked on water. They created this sturdy and vaunted Constitution, valid for all times. And of course, that particular argument really puts in the back seat the struggles of people themselves, because you're supposed to believe that it's the Constitution that rescued us, not the struggles of peoples themselves. And right. So it turns the people themselves, and particularly Black people, the working class, progressive forces globally, into passive bystanders. I mean, which is obviously ludicrous. Now, with regard to Professor Pierre's other point, I've written a number of books on slavery, for example. Race to Revolution deals with slavery in Cuba, and therein of course, you can find that notion of the United States playing the preeminent role in Spanish Cuba, particularly with regard to transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, and in fact, transporting them to Galveston, Texas, both before and after Texas independence, and then transshipping them into Cuba. And I did a book on Brazil that has a similar point, talking about
the deepest South.
The deepest South, which deals with the role of U.S. nationals in helping to make reality the fact that Brazil has the largest Black population outside of Nigeria, with the U.S. nationals mostly snatching Africans from Portuguese Angola, Portuguese Mozambique, and then transporting them across the Atlantic. And then the parallels, once again, in terms of diasporic history, the parallels with U.S. history, because just as you had Black Americans moving to Liberia, moving to other parts of Africa, you had Black Brazilians doing the same thing. As a matter of fact, there is a leading scholar who is of Black American, who's defined as a Black American scholar, who's of Togolese descent. And I've been trying to encourage him to do research on that, because some of the founding fathers of modern Togo actually were Brazilian roots, who then transported themselves across the Atlantic. And just like the same holds true for certain important sectors of Nigeria, which are dominated by Black people who have their roots in Brazil. And then I did, of course, Confronting Black Jacobins, the Haitian Revolution, which puts forth this idea that in order to understand the retreat of slavery in the hemisphere, you have to understand the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which leads to a general crisis of the slave system, which can only be resolved with its collapse, forcing London to move away from the slave trade in 1807, move away from slavery itself in the 1830s, and ultimately putting the United States into a corner whereby it has to abolish slavery as well. And then I did a book on the White Pacific, which deals with the post-1865 slave trade in Melanesians and Polynesians in the South Seas, that the Kingdom of Hawaii, an independent polity, tries to obstruct, and in the process forges an alliance with a rising Japan. And to this very day, a plurality of denizens of the Hawaiian archipelago, or of Japanese origin. But alas, they're overtaken by events, and more precisely overtaken by the U.S. freebooters, and the kingdom is dislodged in the 1890s in an early blow for U.S. imperialism. And then there's my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, which also deals with slavery. And I think I'm intentionally and purposefully concluding this particular segment with that book, because it talks about this alliance with London against London's spawn, speaking of the United States of America, up to and including the last time the capital was invaded so ferociously in August 1814, when the Redcoats, assisted by enslaved Africans, sent President James Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse. And then the formerly enslaved hopping on British boats being transported to Trinidad and Tobago, given land grants where their descendants continue to reside there. Now, oftentimes you'll find these U.S. historians, they don't like to deal with these troublesome aspects. Now, you could say the same thing, I'm afraid to say, about historians who describe themselves as radical, because they think that if they show us siding with the antagonists of the United States, that'll make us even more hated.
Right.
I disagree. I think that it shows that we have options. And so if you folks here in North America don't get yourselves together, we're going to pursue our options to the nth degree. That's the lesson that we need. And plus, we need to present a full history. I mean, it's almost like if you go to a doctor, and the doctor takes a medical history, and you don't want to tell the doctor about the fact that your mother had diabetes or your father had heart disease, because I don't know, maybe you feel it reflects ill upon you. So the doctor won't have enough data to come up with an adequate diagnosis, not to mention a prescription. And so likewise, if you elide all of these important details from the historical record, we're writing history for a purpose. We're writing history, at least some of us, because we're trying to change the world. And if we're not presenting a full and adequate and accurate picture, we're asking the diagnosticians to do something that's very difficult, which is to make an adequate diagnosis based upon an inadequate record, which means they'll come up with an inadequate prescription. Mm-hmm. And certainly that point with regard to the Black people in North America and London is certainly relevant with regard to what I mentioned a moment ago, which is what is the Black position going to be with regard to China, Russia, the European Union? What is our relationship going to be to the CARICOM, the African Union, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that, it's funny. This is apropos of nothing, but I remember Jackie Lukman making a comment a while back that she doesn't use the term founding father. She talks about like the constitutionalists because ain't none of them her daddy. And and likewise, I think we need to think about the United States in the same way. And even the quote unquote founding fathers that, based on your comment where you're saying, historians feel like if we show that we've aligned with the British or the French or whomever else, that we'll be even more hated. Hey, they already hate us.
Right.
They already hate us. And so like they ain't our daddies. Them founding fathers ain't our daddies. So like we need to do what we will and use every tool in our toolkit. So, the next thing I want to talk about, and perhaps the last thing, is in several of your books, including your new boxing book and the jazz book, you examine organized crime. And actually you took up this theme really interestingly and rigorously in your 1997 essay, Rethinking the Lumpen, Gangsters and the Political Economy of Capitalism. And so I'm just wondering, like, what have the effects of organized crime been on, for example, labor, Hollywood, sports, and music? And then what does all of this have to do with race?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, a heads up, if need be, we can go beyond the allotted time. Okay. Secondly, with regard to the lumpen, when I wrote that essay in 1997, this was when I was grappling with writing this book about Zimbabwe. And writing the book about Zimbabwe, I deal quite a bit with mercenaries and freebooters. These Europeans wreaked havoc on newly emergent Africa. From the 1950s, I would say perhaps even up to till today. And I was trying to understand that phenomenon, particularly with regard to Zimbabwe. And if you look at the book on Zimbabwe, it has quite a bit on that particular phenomenon. And indeed, that essay, I originally published it in Zimbabwe when I was, no, I didn't publish it in Zimbabwe. I published it after I came back from Zimbabwe. And then after thinking about that project and process in Southern Africa, it began to animate my thinking when I started writing about labor relations in Hollywood, which eventuates in the book Class Struggle in Hollywood, 1930
and then
to 19...
Just to throw in there, your Zimbabwe book is From the Barrel of a Gun.
Correct.
Okay, I just want people to be able to find all this stuff.
Right, exactly. And so, in dealing with this book on radicals and labor and the Communist Party in Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s, it struck me that organized crime and gangsters played a major role in terms of breaking up strikes, in fact, if you look at the major Hollywood union today, IATSE, International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, it's still dominated to a certain degree by organized crime figures. And then at the same time, you had this phenomenon of so-called gangster rap that was erupting, emerging. And I have to say, I was very disappointed with a lot of the early analysis of this phenomenon, because, I mean, Los Angeles is full of gangsters. I mean, they dominate the major industry. And it's almost as if Compton and Watts and South LA is on one planet and Culver City and the studios are on another planet. Yeah. Shouldn't it have dawned to some of the analysts that some of the Black people were basically walking in the footsteps of other gangsters? I mean, for example, I used to joke that one of the reasons why gangster films have become such a fertile genre within Hollywood. Godfather 1, 2, and 3, State of Grace with Sean Penn, which is actually a very interesting film. It's about the Irish mob in Hell's Kitchen, New York. I mean, the list is endless. It's because gangsters dominate the industry. So, of course, they're going to portray themselves in cinema. And I used to say that if people like myself dominated the industry, you'd have more movies about professors, for example, and more movies about radical activists, for example.
Right, yeah.
And so then, in thinking about that particular conjuncture of Los Angeles, gangsters, Hollywood, music that brought me into this phenomenon known as jazz. I wrote a book, what was it? Jazz and Justice, Racism, the Political Economy of the Music. And even if you're not a big fan, you should be able to infer that the clubs in particular were dominated by organized crime figures, because organized crime is oftentimes looking for cash businesses. Businesses that generate a lot of cash, because then you can launder your ill-gotten gains from other businesses, for example. That's why they're so heavily involved in restaurants, for example, which tends to generate a lot of cash as well. And so that led me to thinking about, of course, not only their relationship to the political economy of the music, but also what was their relationship to the art itself. And I have to say, I didn't get into that as much as I wanted to with regard to that particular book, because as you know, writing these books, even though your name is on the cover, I mean, you're not the only person who's producing this text. You have to deal with hawkish peer reviewers. You have to deal with penny pinching publishers who are always asking you to cut. And so therefore you can always present what you would like to. And then, of course, then that leads you into boxing, which is one of the most corrupt sports in humankind. And in fact, there's a line in that particular book, The Bittersweet Science, where I talk about this one commentator who suggests that if it were not for the lack of headroom, you should hold boxing matches in sewers, because it's such a grimy, corrupt sport. And then that led me into an explanation, among other things, for Muhammad Ali's relationship with the Nation of Islam, because with the fruit of Islam, he had a certain kind of backup that was a barrier to him being exploited, like many of his peers were exploited. And then likewise, it led me into a discussion of how Joe Louis, the heavyweight boxing champion from the 1930s to the 1940s, like many, he has the bright idea of moving from the ring to the executive suites and dominating the sport as a promoter, manager, administrator, hooks up with Truman Gibson, a smart, wizened Black lawyer, a graduate of the University of Chicago, by the way, law school. And by the early 1950s, they're making so much money because boxing becomes a staple of television, the boob tube, which becomes a virtual living room appliance by that time, the early 1950s. But alas, they have to cut deals with organized crime, which has a pre-existing foothold in the sport. And of course, the predictable happens, which is that because the Negroes do not have juice with the district attorney or the U.S. attorney, and their adversaries do, Truman Gibson is indicted, basically. And that particular hookup is virtually destroyed, leaving Joe Louis, then, who, by the way, had very close ties to the left. Your listeners might want to go online and listen to the tune King Joe by Paul Robeson, assisted by the Count Basie Orchestra, for example. Joe Louis had ties to the Southern Conference for Human Welfare. And so once the Red Scare starts and Joe Louis has these left-wing ties, as you know, you didn't necessarily have to be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party to come under scrutiny. That's for sure. It's just to have left-wing ties or even liberal ties to a certain degree. And so then he gets hit with all these Internal Revenue Service liens and duns, and ends his life basically as a greeter at Las Vegas casinos, living from hand to mouth at the sufferance of other mob-tied celebrities like Frank Sinatra, the late crooner and actor. So one of the lessons I was trying to draw there for the younger audience in particular, who oftentimes tell us, well, why don't these people move into the business world? Well, it's not enough to try to move into the business world. You got to have juice in the political world.
Right.
Because your opponents will, and they'll bring down the hammer of the law against you. And then the same holds true in a more controversial point concerning my jazz book, because I assess that it was not necessarily a step forward when the Black musicians unions were liquidated and forced to fold themselves into the larger so-called white unions. Oftentimes their records were lost. Oftentimes they did not have as much political influence in those Euro-American dominated unions. Oftentimes the club owners had more of an excuse to exclude them and hire talents of lesser eminence than these Black American musicians. And so one of the lessons I draw from there is that I think for an unforeseeable time to come, we're going to have to try to organize these Black-led entities, because, and I say this in particular because these Euro-Americans who've had plenty of opportunity to write the true history of the United States. After all, when we were barred from archives, they weren't barred from archives.
Right.
And yet I think that for the most part, they failed miserably. Full stop.
Which is to say they succeeded because, like, as Oliver Cox says, like, these bourgeois social scientists and historians are invested in the status quo. Like, why would they be invested in telling particular types of histories that contravene the mythology of the United States? So if it ain't John Brown, it ain't for me. So what I did want to ask you, a related question, what do you do with the trimmings? So you once told me that in terms of writing, use every part of the animal. And if it is that these publishers make you cut out all this shit, like, what do you do with it? Do you write an article? Like, what do you do?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, you try to write articles. In the Negro Comrades of the Crown book, I remember when I turned in the manuscript, the editor told me to cut 400 pages.
You told me that about the Barnett book too, the Black Press book, that they made you cut it in half.
Yeah,
that's a book. 400 pages is a whole other book.
I know.
What do you
mean? And then they don't give you guidance. I mean, obviously, as I put it in there, I thought it was important to include, and so to tell me to cut stuff without giving me guidance. So what I tried to do in that book is, I'm afraid to say, is I just included the sources for a lot of stuff that I cut, and so you'll find like these long footnotes, in that book, because I'm not only writing for the contemporary audience, I'm writing for future generations, which is obviously optimistic because I'm assuming that the world will still be here. We won't be overcome by climate change or nuclear war. And so I'm trying to provide sources for scholars in the future to peruse.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things you do. You can write articles, you can try to have long footnotes. If you look at my papers at the Schomburg, you'll find, I remember, you'll find entire books that have not been published. I did a
Malcolm X book.
Did a Malcolm X book that has never been published, and because the publisher wouldn't take it, because the publisher didn't like my interpretation. So
part of it is in the Fire This Time book. Right.
Yeah, part of the themes, and actually part of the themes also are in the boxing book, because in the Fire This Time book, in the Malcolm X book, and the boxing book, I try to deal with Black masculinity and its evolution, but it's sort of hit and miss. I mean, because it's I was telling another interviewer the other day that in my 16th century book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, there's an entire critique of religion from page one to the final page. However, when I talk in the media or the radio and podcasts about it, I don't necessarily get into that because in a book, you can provide substantiation, documentation, argument. It's a very sensitive subject, needless to say, where you're prone to being taken out of context and pilloried. And so, this writing books is not as simple as it seems.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've written a lot of them and you make it seem simple, and all you'll give us is the secret is clean living. And we're That's like, right. What that mean? And then you say, if you have to ask the question, you've already missed the point, which is not helpful, but we'll figure it out. But thank you so much, Gerald Horne. I have loved this conversation. It has been so informative. And I hope to have you back soon at some point to talk about your Texas book, which is
right on.
In progress.
Oh, and I have some other books too I can talk about. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you. All right, so for this segment of What I'm On, I really am just thinking about balancing writing the manuscript. Y'all know that's still a struggle, but less so. I really have taken February seriously. So I've stepped into the ring. I began, revising one of my dissertation chapters into one of the book chapters. So I am working, at least a little bit every day on the book. But I also believe in keeping an active scholarship pipeline. And so there's a way in which myself and just scholars in general have to balance like working on the book manuscript and then working on what I call just like side projects. And so I'm working on this article co-authored with Gerald Horne on W.E.B. Du Bois, imperialism and labor. It's a little bit overdue, but I'm working on that. I'm working on an interview kind of dialogue type essay, another one with Gerald Horne. I'm working on some different pieces here and there. So it's really important, I think, on the one hand, to carve out space to work on like the big projects, but also like the other thing I want to keep top of mind is also holding space to work out other types of ideas or other types of things that I'm thinking about. So I also want to do some blog posts. I'm also doing the work for the Black Agenda Review. And, that's a more collaborative and collective form of writing. And that can be a little bit difficult, right? We got to bring everybody's ideas and everybody's feedback together, which is a different type of writing, but one that I really enjoy. And so, as I just move through academia and work toward hitting my different types of goals, whether it be getting tenure, whether it be, one of my very early goals was to have like a book manuscript every 2 years, every 1.5 to 2 years. We'll see if that actually happens because this first one is hard. But I hear that once you get the first one out, it flows much easier because, you're used to the process and all this. But I just really want to emphasize, and this is true for academia, but it could be true in other forms of creative work as well. Is just, you have your big project, but also hold space for the other types of things that you're interested in writing about or interrogating or making art about or whatever. And the key to that is planning. So I think I mentioned in episode 1 a little bit about sort of like I'm a big planner. I do my spreadsheets every week. And so that's just what I'm on this week is really holding space to get back into my book manuscript, but also holding space to work on some different ideas, some different forms of side writing that I want to put out there. But the other thing too, and what I always need to remind myself is to say no, because I feel like sometimes my past self is not very respectful of my future self because I say yes, to a lot of things that probably in retrospect, it's a good opportunity, but not a great one. And when it comes down to actually sitting down to write it, I'm like, why did I say I was going to do this shit? And so that's the other thing too, is like saying no is a muscle. And for me, it's very, very easy to say no to things I don't want to do. It's much more difficult saying no to things that are good opportunities or that I'm interested in, but that I don't necessarily have the capacity or bandwidth for, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is a strategy like, okay, if this was due next week, would I say yes? And if the answer is no, then I need to say no, because ultimately there will come a time when that piece of writing is due next week. And then I'll have to do it. And hopefully I would have been working on it the whole time. That's not always the case. But anyway, that's what I'm on, thinking about writing as per usual, thinking about balancing these projects, thinking about, doing things that I care about in relationship to doing things that are going to help me meet my goals and hit my milestones. So, it's an ongoing process. There's, some brief insight into that. Jared, do you have any closing thoughts?
So I do. First of all, I want to thank you again for sharing some of those insights, because I wish it were true for all of us that getting through one book project makes it easier to get to the next one. So I hope it is true for you and everyone else, because some of us still struggle even after that. But my real two closing thoughts are, one, I think it was so dope to see in the discussion with Professor Horne, the intergenerational piece and the willingness and the foresight on his part to recognize what I don't think everyone is so willing to do, that is limited, and we need to be extending traditions and helping those traditions continue. To playing that Jigna role is, I think, really important. And then the other thing is, I'm just very glad to have heard you say what you said briefly about the use of this phrase "black bodies." I struggle with that. I'm not a fan, and anyway. So I just wanted to say that. That's it. So appreciate you. Another great episode.
And that's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. CBS here with Jared Ball, and we are signing off.